You're listening to The World at 8 with Lynne Mozart. The World at 8, the number one in nationalist news.
Firstly, before I read the news today, I must apologise for the mistake I made in the Wednesday thought. It was on the parentage of the poor little children killed by their father, Mick Philpott. They were his and his wife's 6 children. The fatal blaze that tore through the house in Victory Road, Derby, was started by the trio in an effort to try and frame Philpott's former mistress, Lisa Willis, after she left the family home with her 5 children 3 months earlier, so Philpott and his wife could get those 5 children back and probably their extra child benefits. So apologies to my listeners, but not of course the Philpotts, who should hang. Off topic from the above, I had a lovely message from a gentleman who is partially sighted and relies on the World at 8 for his news. It's so good to know we're helping people like him not to feel so cut off from society and nationalism. Highlights of the news today, Friday the 5th of April. Cutting the minimum wage is no way to make work pay. BBC silence over licence fee loophole. Rorke's Drift survivor remembered after 130 years. There are illegal immigrants and then there are... Air France fined for removing pro-Palestinian activists from flight to Israel. Belly of the Beast with Nick Griffin on UKIP, defectors. Stop the boats until all this is sorted. A Christian catastrophe, Islamist cleansing in the Middle East. Thought for the day, the NHS, are we really fooled by TV propaganda? And finally, who's got the horn then? UK news. Cutting the minimum wage is no way to make work pay. Well, I never thought I'd agree with the Green Party or its leader, Natalie Bennett, but her article in the Huffington Post is one I cannot fault and must recommend. In her article she writes, the government's stated aim in introducing the bedroom tax, in slashing of council tax benefit that forms a new poll tax, in ending of disability living allowance and making a host of other benefit cuts is to make work pay. Just start with the fact that the smaller social homes that the bedroom tax sufferers are supposed to move into simply don't exist. And as many have pointed out, the jobs that the government is telling benefit recipients to go out and get also don't exist. 2.5 million people, 7.8% of the workforce, are looking for jobs, and there are about 500,000 vacancies. We do need to make work pay, but we need to do that by ensuring every job pays at least a living wage, is stable and secure, is a job that you can build a life on, a job you can pay the rent and bills on. And we need to provide benefits, decent benefits, that allow those who don't have their jobs to have a decent life. World at 8 says, one must remember that although this one piece may seem very good and sway many towards the Green cause, the Green Party and its policies would have us back in the dark ages, swamped with immigrants and inundated with left-wing socialist human rights claptrap faster than any of the failing so-called major parties. BBC silence over licence fee loophole. Larissa Brown of Mail Online writes, the BBC is refusing to disclose how many people say they do not need a television licence because they're watching shows online, and goes to say more than 1 million households do not pay the £145.50 annual fee, according to the Times newspaper. The BBC fears it could lose even further revenue if the public knew the full scale of people legally, without a licence, watching TV through catch-up service such as the BBC's iPlayer and ITV's ITV Player. Some programmes are even being made available on iPlayer before they're broadcast. The BBC, in turning down a Freedom of Information request on the number of households claiming no TV licence was needed, claimed the information would be of use to those seeking to evade paying the licence fee. The Department for Culture, Media and Sport said that it might look at changing the scope of the licence fee when deciding the fee that will apply from March 2017. A Rorke's Drift survivor remembered after 130 years. A soldier who survived the Battle of Rorke's Drift against 4,000 Zulus, only to be forgotten on its roll of honour, has finally been hailed as a war hero, thanks to a 130-year-old sketch. Private David Jenkins was amongst the 150 soldiers who fought in the heroic defence of the small South African missionary outpost in 1879. Such was the bravery shown by the heavily outnumbered troops that after the battle 11 Victoria Crosses were awarded. However, Private Jenkins's name was somehow left out of the Roll of Honour, and for more than 130 years his descendants have tried in vain to have his heroism recognised. But they had no proof, until spotting a sketch of a Private Jenkins by a Victorian war artist that was being used to illustrate a competition run by the National Army Museum. The Battle of Rorke's Drift has been nominated as one of Britain's greatest battles, and the image chosen to represent it was a pencil sketch by Lady Elizabeth Butler of Private Jenkins. His great-grandson, Jeff Rees, recognised the face instantly and was able to prove to historians that his relative was a long-forgotten war hero. Each soldier who survived the battle had also been given a Bible to commemorate their role. Private Jenkins' Bible was handed over to the museum's historians as added proof that he had fought at Rorke's Drift. Private David Jenkins of the 1st Battalion, 24th 2nd Warwickshire Regiment of Foot has now been reinstated in the battle's Roll of Honour. European news. There are illegal immigrants and then there are... The Express claims a senior Eurocrat sparked outrage last night after calling for the phrase illegal immigrant to be banned from the European Union. But early research appears to show the only individual outraged is UKIP's Nigel Farage, and the only news source promoting his outrage is the Express. While Kuna, Kuwait news agency, reports EU Home Affairs Commissioner Cecilia Malmstrom Thursday praised the Associated Press news agency for dropping the term illegal immigrant from its style book. The Express reports UKIP's Nigel Farage as saying, "Now the EU is even trying to change the language. It shows what we are dealing with here is a totalitarian mindset." World Day says, the UKIP promoting Express is no better than the language-changing Swedish socialist Malmstrom or the big business toady Farage. They all want to destroy our society and remake it in their own image. Air France fined for removing pro-Palestinian activists from flight to Israel. The incident happened at Nice airport in April 2012 as Horea Ancour boarded a flight from Nice to Tel Aviv to join other activists in the pro-Palestinian campaign dubbed Flytilla by the media. Ancour, who was placed on a no-fly list by Israeli authorities, claimed an Air France employee asked her whether she had an Israeli passport or was Jewish before she was escorted from the plane. Air France said her name was on a list of undesirables provided by Israeli authorities and in line with an international convention that allows airlines to refuse transport to passengers who it knew would not be accepted at point of entry. It asked her to disembark. A French court has found Air France guilty of discrimination for removing the pro-Palestinian activist from a flight to Israel because she was not Jewish. The court also ordered the airline to pay €13,000, equivalent to £11,000, $17,000 in fines and damages. Air France has said it would appeal. This presenter says, fine, does it mean I can sue the Egyptian authorities for removing me from a British transport line arriving off a KLM flight to Cairo 30 years ago for supposedly having a Jewish sounding name and holding me for some hours with 2 armed soldiers? Belly of the beast. I now hand you over to Nick Griffin MEP, who today is covering UKIP defectors.
The European Union is institutionally anti-Christian. Traditionalists all over the crumbling Brussels Empire have complained for years about the pointed lack of any reference to Christianity among the list of founding values of the EU. But even atheistic Marxists like their Easter holiday break, so this week was a green week, one of those supposedly allocated for constituency work, during which only the terminally greediest of MEPs go to Brussels in order to draw their daily attendance allowance. Most of them will have spent the Easter Green Week somewhere green and warm, although I did hear some last week talking about how they were looking forward to the last skiing holiday of the winter. For me, there was still grubby snow piled up along the sides of the roads, in the hills around Accrington, Burnley and Pendle, and on the tops of the Cumbrian Fells. But that was the only evidence of global warming that I saw. Still, I spent the week on constituency work as we're supposed to, and I can report plenty of support out there for the BNP, and huge amounts of anger against the Condem regime over their various failings, and against Labour councils for raising council taxes rather than putting up any kind of fight against the continued dismantling of Britain. The political news continues to stem largely from the controlled media's continued love-in with UKIP, which is now clearly the weapon of choice for media moguls and hacks, angered by the Tories' pitiful attempts to limit the democracy-breaking powers of the professional liars of the media elite. There is, of course, no denying that the relentless media plugs and the vast amounts of City of London money they have to play with means that UKIP are riding high at present. There's no point denying it or avoiding the issue. Instead, we must tackle them head-on whenever they try to move away from their elderly middle-class support base and attempt to move into our working-class heartlands. Canvassing in the evenings after several days' constituency work in parts of the northwest this week, my team and I experimented with several anti-UKIP messages. We soon found the simplest and the best. They're just rich Tories. It doesn't even seem to need explaining. If necessary, of course, the evidence is all there. Farage getting into politics in anger at the EU imposing rules to control City of London casino commodity broking firms like his. UKIP MEPs fiddling their expenses into their family businesses, and the party welcoming the notorious Tory expenses cheats, the Hamiltons. Former Tory MP turned UKIP leader Roger Knapman using a gang of Polish builders to install luxury bathrooms in his listed Devon mansion. The ultra-Thatcherite voting record of UKIP MEPs in Brussels. I could go on and on. But the good news is that on the doors, you don't have to. Time and time again, the response to our point that they're just rich Tories was a thoughtful expression followed by, yes, you're right. Job done. More, of course, will be needed to convince those not blessed with a healthy automatic rejection of Tory hypocrisy and greed. So we'll be looking also at the records I've kept of the voting patterns of the UKIP MEPs who sit a couple of rows in front of me in Parliament. How many of their current supporters will think, again, once we tell them how UKIP vote time and time again for a free-for-all for the banksters, not just because they oppose, as we do, the idea of Brussels making such regulations, but because they don't think the banks need regulating at all. But of course they wouldn't, would they? Because UKIP are bankrolled by City of London high flyers, and he who pays the piper calls the tune. When I look at the devastation being wrought on the social structure of our country, as the political elite make us all pay for the banksters' crisis, I am, in my angrier moments, much inclined to the slogan, don't let Brussels cap our bankers, we should hang the thieving bastards ourselves. Among the other deeply unpopular votes reflecting UKIP's status as cat's paws of the ruthless corporate elite are their fervent support for GM crops, their enthusiasm for allowing US oil giants to frack up our countryside, and their backing for special free trade deals to allow cheap labour countries such as Pakistan to flood the British market and destroy British jobs. But it all pales into insignificance when compared to UKIP's brutally cynical exploitation of popular concerns over immigration. Quote, stop open door EU immigration, unquote, say the billboards they've got up all over the country right now. It's Maggie Thatcher's swamp speech all over again. The public hear the left-wing media's condemnation of alleged UKIP racism and think the slogan means they're opposed to all immigration. But as I explained last week, UKIP are in fact hostile to immigration from Eastern Europe for the specific reason that it shuts out the immigrants they want to see coming to Britain, hundreds of thousands a year from Africa, India and Pakistan. So we need to get across the difference between UKIP's mealy-mouthed, deceitful, meaningless message about stopping open-door EU immigration and our own position. Britain's full-up, stop all immigration, full stop, and reverse the flow so that our children and grandchildren can live in peace and prosperity in a British Britain. I received a very good email from a third-year student at one of our oldest universities the other day. He explained that he'd always been a nationalist while he was a conservative, and last year joined UKIP, believing that it was operating to a concealed nationalist agenda, or at the very least, could be pushed to do so. Quote, I'm emailing you tonight, he said, to say how relieved I was today to hear your sensible, purist nationalist stance in regard to non-intervention in the Middle East, and in almost every other regard, and your realistic definition of what a nation should be and should therefore never tolerate. I've recently become a BNP Gold member, and I'm a UKIP defector. The local UKIP branch, by the way, probably still think I'm a member, an activist for UKIP. You're absolutely right about UKIP in due course collapsing, and their supporters coming to the BNP, even past Conservatives, in fact especially past Conservatives, because they're far more traditionally minded than many first-time UKIP voters. This January, he goes on, I inquired to my local UKIP coordinator about the liberal nature of their immigration policies, calmly assuring myself that they probably were being liberal in this regard only until they get into office, after which I thought they'd become more hardline in protecting our nation. My personal investigation into UKIP as a UKIP member was motivated due to hearing you speak about UKIP back in January, especially the strong point pertaining to Enoch Powell and the contradictions with UKIP. As an enthusiastic Powellite, like many in UKIP and in the Conservative Party, I felt utterly betrayed when I was told implicitly that UKIP finds no fault with immigration at all on a genetic or ethnic level, and I realised that they honestly do think that 50,000 plus net variations is acceptable, even though they say the net variations will have work permit standards applied to them. Does that really help when it means by definition they're coming to take our jobs? So I sent for my British National Party info pack that night and then became a BNP member 2 months later, after my local UKIP coordinator demonstrated such a vile anti-white, anti-realist mentality, and after hearing all the pro-Zionist and thus anti-British trash who dominate UKIP, I hope and believe that you will indeed be getting UKIP defectors and Conservative defectors sooner than you might have thought. Just keep hitting them with the honest right hook, exposés as you are doing, and have local leaflets regarding such sent to light Tory areas, not just working class areas. Don't think middle class folk want to screw the poor and thus don't want to join the BNP. Hell, the rural middle class and upper class, what's left of it, are almost all nationalists at heart and have the intelligence to see through such operations as UKIP, if only you give them the facts they need. Our new member went on to give some more interesting and heartening inside information. I quote, "There's an internal war in UKIP between libertarians and traditional right-wingers, which is splitting the right wing of that party. Then there are the thousands of ex-conservative types, many of them One Nation conservatives, i.e. non-conservatives, and Zionists who've completely taken over large sections of UKIP. Many of the ones higher up, including on the NEC, are weird, spiritless people who seem politically passive. The party is unstable and won't be there forever. They really don't have any firm beliefs at all. I'm glad to have found my political home in the BNP with people who do." Unquote. Amen to that. Amen.
Thank you, Nick. World news. Stop the boats until this is sorted. The Australian Herald's son's Andrew Bolt writes, "If Afghan men have a culture which leaves them more likely to rape, and our courts have a culture of being more lenient as a consequence, I suggest Australian women have an interest in stopping the boats until we get this sorted out." An Afghan refugee who argued cultural differences led him to rape a drunken girl has won an appeal against a 14-year jail term. Esmatullah Sharifi, 31, pleaded guilty at separate hearings to raping a teen on December the 19th, 2008 and a woman, 25, on Christmas Eve. He's been granted leave to appeal against the sentence for raping the teen. Granting leave to appeal, Court of Appeal Justice Robert Redlich said, "The sentencing judge rejected any suggestion Sharifi didn't have a clear concept of consent in sexual relations." But he said the 18-year-old victim had found there were aspects of his conduct that were strange because Sharifi treated her like a willing participant. He noted that Sharifi, who came to Australia on a temporary protection visa in 2001, also drove her home. It proves, in my view, an adequate basis for most grounds of appeal that Sharifi wishes to pursue, the judge said. But in his sentencing remarks, Judge Mark Dean said Sharifi had gone hunting for vulnerable drunken women to rape. I wonder how those two women feel about the failure to stop the boats and enforce our own cultural norms. World Date reported on a similar story in January where Judge Michael Stokes of Nottingham Crown Court spared an 18-year-old Adil Rashid from a prison sentence because he was naive and immature in sexual matters. What is it with the English-speaking judges? Are they bereft of all sanity and common sense? They have all forgotten the victims' rights and go overboard to ensure the human rights of criminals, in particular Islamic criminals. What these judges fail to understand is that however lenient they may be, they are still kuffar as far as any Muslim is concerned, and if at any time in the future these men think they will be spared what might come, they are very, very wrong. A Christian catastrophe, Islamist cleansing in Middle East. Ralph Peters writes in the New York Post opposing editorial, Islamist terrorists and fanatics are methodically exterminating the 2,000-year-old Christian civilization of the Middle East through oppression, threats, appropriations and deadly violence. Our media ignore the intensifying savagery against Christians in Muslim Brotherhood-controlled Egypt. Unconfirmed reports assert that, in the last month, Muslim brothers dragged Christian protesters to a mosque and tortured them, but our reporters won't look into an Islamist Abu Ghraib. For a century and a half, the varied strands of Middle East Christianity have faced increasingly fierce pogroms, and for the Armenians, outright genocide. But with the rise of Wahhabi and Salafist terror, the long slow-motion Holocaust accelerated. If Islam is a religion of peace, it's time to show the evidence to the endangered Christians of the Middle East. But disappointingly, few Muslims actively defend religious minorities. It's not unlike Nazi Germany, where most Germans didn't want to murder Jews, but were complicit through their silence. Thought for the day. The NHS, are we really fooled by TV propaganda? Are the great British public really fooled by certain TV reports and research programmes? I saw one the other day on our National Health Service, or rather what there is left of it, for us Brits, and the very clever placing of certain words and people did Hollywood proud. I did think for an instance, and a very short one at that at last there would be some honesty about some of the facts and figures that have affected our NHS for the last 30-odd years. But no. The facts that were relayed to the GBP were not any of the following. It did not address huge intakes of foreign, often none fully trained nursing staff from abroad. It did not address doctors likewise needing translators in the operating theatres. It did not address Muslim staff and patients being given more consideration for their faith and culture than our own people. It did not address massive increase in immigrant births in NHS hospitals, straining what resources we have left. It did not address diseases long ago eradicated from the UK on the return. It did not address personnel and services strained by disabled, both physically and mentally, from intermarriages of certain ethnic minorities. It did not address many of our own hospitals being in ethnic community areas with the resulting third world attitude. It did not address more money goes to foreign aid than goes into our health service. It did not address immigrants within the last few years encouraged to head the queues in hospitals and surgeries, indeed medical refugees deemed more important than our elderly. It did not address huge amounts of money spent for food which is ruined and lost by kitchen staff. The wastage in NHS hospitals is enormous. It did not address the so-called cleaners, usually from the third world. They don't clean. It's down to visitors and staff to wash their hands, which is silly when all the germs come from either the kitchen or the dirty wards. It did not address the authorities have done away with matrons or anyone with any real medical knowledge or power apart from the doctors or surgeons on the wards. It did not address that it is common to see whole gaggles of ethnic nurses just chatting away in their own language whilst patients need attention. Many of these imported medical workers have no idea of our culture, language or needs in hospitals, and any supervision is classed as racist. I'm sure I could go on, but I won't. What did this programme actually say to us, the public? What were the reasons given for poor care, neglect and sometimes cruelty in our medical establishments? The two main reasons given for the lapses over the past years were an increase in the elderly in this country, all white of course, new staff and old methodology in the workplace. Now when you've recovered from this blast of apparent common sense and politically correct crap, the message was in the film itself. When they showed discreetly fuzzy pictures of a ward during the day, all the staff were of one ethnic variety or another. However, when they showed a training nurse situation, the patient was of course a crumbling Brit. They showed 2 white young female nurses and 1 white male nurse. All very Enid Blyton. The programme centred on the Alexandra Hospital in Redditch, which in the past had a very bad record. One of their patients had been a nurse in the days when nursing was a calling and a profession. Hard work and hard training, but those nurses were the done deal. This poor lady at 86 had to go into this hospital as she'd had a fall. She was dealt with badly, left in her own faeces, ignored, never bathed, and when a relation questioned this, she was told the nurses had no time. Her daughter said these nurses worked 8-hour shifts and did nothing much more than chatter amongst themselves. Of course, the ethnicity of these people was not given or even hinted at. 12 weeks later this old lady died. One of her relations had tried to get her out and was refused. Much like the case of my mother, who although in a private wing was still subjected to bad care, and I had to get a St John's ambulance vehicle and driver privately to move her out as the hospital concerned would not do it. She had been tied to her bed and heavily sedated. She lived 5 more years. Our NHS used to be the envy of the world, and quite right. Although a Labour baby, this along with the useful needed unions was a step in the right direction, and one which was needed after the last war. But our NHS is no longer ours. You may think I blame immigration and immigrants for everything, but I don't. But I do blame them and greedy corporations and pharmaceutical firms and employment agencies for the downturn in what was supposed to be a free service to those who couldn't afford high medical fees either from GPs or hospitals. This service was for our poor, elderly, disabled and needy. It was not for people flying into this country to have stupid and unnecessary operations. It was not for people from the sub-Saharan continent to receive free treatment for AIDS and HIV, costing thousands of pounds per person for perpetuity. It was not to bring into the world entire generations of races of people who were not English or British, with all their ensuing complications and time. It was not to deal with strange foreign illnesses and epidemics. In short, it was for us, not them. And the same goes for staffing. There are over 400,000 nurses working in the NHS today. How many are well qualified, well educated Brits? Not many. Our own doctors cannot find work within this institution, and yet we import doctors from abroad quite happily and retrain them, and in the cases of just letting them in without the English language, we supply, on your taxes, interpreters for them to do sign languages to the patients concerned. And this service costs millions of pounds. In 1948 our NHS was brought into being. A record level of people use the NHS now. There are 2,000 less nurses in the last 2 years. 6 out of 10 staff wouldn't like their relatives in the hospitals in which they work. The culture of compassion and the happiness revolution apply to elderly patients, supposedly. But the biggest mistake is the culture of diversity, which is bringing down what was one of our best institutions. Of course, the whole mishmash is put down to our increasingly growing elderly population, which is the reason always given to bring in yet more immigrants to apparently look after them. But they aren't, are they? That is not what they do. For every one ethnic persona who provides good and constant service, there are many who do not, and who milk the system at the same time. One of the closing pictures of this programme was a circle of very old people sitting around with a carefully chosen mix of white and ethnic nurses holding a large sheet with a hole in it and all trying to get a ball through the hole. If I ever get to that stage, somebody please shoot me. On a happier note, if Sir David Nicholson was sitting there and the ball had to hit him, that would be a better game plan. The truth is that 14 NHS trusts have high mortality rates. That is why they blame it on the elderly. They die, don't they? Despite being ignored, bathed in their own filth, starved and laughed at, they still survive a few weeks or months. But the one thing the reporter didn't comment on was how much these poor old dears cost the NHS. I bet not nearly as much as the new immigrant mothers and the immigrant sick cost us, and they have never paid a penny into a service which successive governments have encouraged them to use without any conscience at all. My message to the NHS is stop being so politically correct. Start employing our own. Bring back matrons and stop this backbiting workplace policy that prevents whistleblowers. Send back foreign medical staff who do not perform satisfactorily. Encourage more hospice care for the dying elderly. They shouldn't die in a ward. And open good mental homes again for long-term mental illness patients. Take some medical agencies and care home ownership back into the state where they can be monitored. Those private homes left should be British owned for British people and monitored separately and thoroughly. What is needed in the NHS is discipline and get rid of the money men. We also need to stop thinking that because we have an ethnic workforce we should be grateful and do nothing when things go wrong for fear of being accused of racism, because according to our TV there are no ethnic workers in the NHS at all, and they must be right, mustn't they? And this leaflet I have in my hand from the Surrey NHS Patient Transport Guide showing a large black man wheeling an old black lady into an ambulance isn't really showing that at all, is it? And finally, Someone's got the horn. Forget African poachers. We've imported our own greedy, selfish idiots into the UK, as it has been reported on Sky News that rhinos in our UK parks could be targeted for their much prized horns. These horns are supposed to increase the size or whatever of little southeastern Asian willies, and if you believe a magnificent animal should die for that, you're sillier than I already thought you are. Park officials have called on volunteers to help beef up security, whilst the police, no less, have stepped up security at 2 wildlife parks in South East England in response to a plot to hunt rhinos. The parks in Kent, Port Lympne and Howletts have also called for volunteers to help them carry out 24-hour patrols. There are 20 black rhinos at the parks out of just 45 in the whole of Europe. There was an anonymous information through Crime Stoppers saying there was a possible attack on rhinos, said PC Michael Laidlow, Wildlife Crime Officer for Kent Police. We've spoken to all the owners of rhinos in the South East and they're taking measures to combat it. All our wildlife officers are aware of the information and we're taking steps to increase patrols in the area. Rhino horn is worth £65,000 a kilogram, which makes it more valuable than cocaine, heroin and gold. Bob O'Connor, Managing Director of Howletts and Port Lympne, said, "What we're worried about is criminals taking it to the next level. We've upped our nighttime patrols, we've doubled that straight away with our keepers who live on the site. We have to take this as a credible threat." This presenter says that, "And now these criminals know the actual place, what steps are being taken plus the price, they'll move in. Talk about chatter costs lives. I'm surprised the sodding police haven't tweeted it. Especially since last year when 2 men were jailed after a previously failed attempt to steal a rhino head from a museum in Norwich. At the gang of 4, 3 of whom were ethnics, one Nihad Mahmood, 21, Iraqi, no fixed address, and Patrick Keeley, whose defence was his family were threatened by the other 3 after the aborted attempt earlier that year to steal the head, which was dismissed by the politically correct judge, were jailed for 2 years. The other 2 remain at large and are probably going down south as we speak." You've been listening to The World at 8. I am Lynne Mozart, and I and the team at World at 8 and Radio Britain wish you all a very happy and a very safe weekend.
You're listening to The World at 8 with Lynne Mozart. The World at 8, the #1 in nationalist news.
Firstly, before I read the news today, I must apologise for the mistake I made in the Wednesday thought. It was on the parentage of the poor little children killed by their father Mick Philpott. They were his and his wife's 6 children. The fatal blaze that tore through the house in Victory Road, Derby, was started by the trio in an effort to try and frame Philpott's former mistress, Lisa Willis, after she left the family home with her 5 children 3 months earlier, so Philpott and his wife could get those 5 children back and probably their extra child benefits. So apologies to my listeners, but not of course the Philpotts, who should hang. Or if the public knew the full scale of people legally, without a licence, watching TV through catch-up service such as the BBC's iPlayer and ITV's ITV Player. Some programmes are even being made available on iPlayer before they're broadcast. The BBC, in turning down a Freedom of Information request on the number of households claiming no TV licence was needed, claimed the information would be of use to those seeking to evade paying the licence fee. The Department for Culture, Media and Sport said that it might look at changing the scope of the licence fee when deciding the fee that will apply from March 2017. A Rorke's Drift survivor remembered after 130 years. A soldier who survived the Battle of Rorke's Drift against 4,000 Zulus, only to be forgotten on its roll of honour, has finally been hailed as a war hero, thanks to a 130-year-old sketch. Private David Topic from the above, I had a lovely message from a gentleman who is partially sighted and relies on the World at 8 for his news. It's so good to know we're helping people like him not to feel so cut off from society and nationalism. Highlights of the news today, Friday the 5th of April. Cutting the minimum wage is no way to make work pay. BBC silence over licence fee loophole. Rorke's Drift survivor remembered after 130 years. There are illegal immigrants and then there are… Air France fined for removing pro-Palestinian activists from flight to Israel. Belly of the beast with Nick Griffin on UKIP, defectors. Stop the boats until all this is sorted. A Christian catastrophe, Islamist cleansing in the Middle East. Thought for the day, the NHS, are we really fooled by TV propaganda? And finally, who's got the horn then? Stable and secure is a job that you can build a life on, a job you can pay the rent and bills on, and we need to provide benefits, decent benefits, that allow those who don't have their jobs to have a decent life. World Today says, one must remember that although this one piece may seem very good and sway many towards the Green cause, the Green Party and its policies would have us back in the dark ages, swamped with immigrants and inundated with left-wing socialist human rights claptrap faster than any of the failing so-called major parties. BBC silence over licence fee loophole. Larissa Brown of Mail Online writes, the BBC is refusing to disclose how many people say they do not need a television licence because they're watching shows online, and goes to say more than 1 million households do not pay the £145.50 annual fee, according to the Times newspaper. The BBC fears it could lose even further revenue. UK News. Cutting the minimum wage is no way to make work pay. Well, I never thought I'd agree with the Green Party or its leader, Natalie Bennett, but her article in the Huffington Post is one I cannot fault, I must recommend. In her article she writes, the government's stated aim in introducing the bedroom tax, in slashing of council tax benefit that forms a new poll tax, in ending of disability living allowance and making a host of other benefit cuts is to make work pay. Just start with the factor that the smaller social homes that the bedroom tax sufferers are supposed to move into simply don't exist. And as many have pointed out, the jobs that the government is telling benefit recipients to go out and get also don't exist. 2.5 million people, 7.8% of the workforce, are looking for jobs, and there are about 500,000 vacancies. We do need to make work pay, but we need to do that by ensuring every job pays at least a living wage,